It's 11 p.m. in the emergency room when Frank's heart surgery begins. That night, it's Christopher Errington, the anesthetist, who's on duty for 24 hours and is responsible for putting him to sleep. But nothing is going to go as planned. Christopher has performed over 15,000 anesthesias in 11 years, and he will be the one to recount this story later. To start with, when Frank arrives in the operating room, he's practically dead already. So, saying putting him to sleep is quite an understatement. The goal is essentially to try to keep him alive in any way possible, while the surgical team rushes to the heart-lung machine. 90 minutes later, it's decided that to repair the heart and aorta, Frank needs to be placed in complete circulatory arrest. The team then decides to cool Frank's body because it helps in order to significantly limit the potentially severe and irreversible damage to the brain due to the critical lack of oxygen. Then the heart-lung machine is stopped for 94 minutes. Normally, the chances of survival are extremely low for any period of circulatory arrest longer than 45 minutes. Around 5:30 in the morning, Frank is transferred to the intensive care unit. Around 8 a.m., anesthetist Christopher Errington heads home after 25 hours straight at the hospital. He usually checks on all these cases when he returns to the hospital. That morning, around 11:30, he stops by the intensive care unit to check on what happened to Frank, thinking he would either be dead or dying during this shift. He's awake. Shocked, Christopher makes sure it's the right patient. He carefully reviews the tests and vital signs from the past 30 hours. A truly impressive recovery, medically speaking, and thoroughly. But it's not over yet. The next day, Frank is awake again. He's talking and asking for a second breakfast. He says to Christopher, "Dr. Harrington, I want to thank you for what you did in there." Christopher Errington, surprised, looks at his lab coat. He doesn't have his ID badge on him, and he hasn't introduced himself. Frank then says to him, "I'll recognize your voice anywhere." Christopher recounts that he then approached the hospital bed and introduced himself, but Frank must have noticed the incredulous look on his face and said to him, "Don't worry, everyone has that look when I tell them and they find out I was awake the whole time in the operating room." Christopher's heart leaps in his chest. He knows that fully remembering the events is impossible. When a patient is clinically dead before the operation, then dead for an additional 94 minutes in the middle of it. Christopher comes to his senses and then says, "I'm really glad to see you awake. Tell me more." Frank looks at him, a big smile on his face. "I know what you did and said in there. You never gave up, even when the surgeon told me it was over and that we had to stop." He then recited from memory the 3 serial numbers on top of the 3 surgical lights in operating room number 20, before adding, "I was stuck up there, on the ceiling, watching all of that. Those stupid numbers and letters were the only things I could read." "I love reading." Frank shares his experience for nearly 15 minutes. He will leave the hospital about 2 weeks later and will undergo extended cardiac rehabilitation. Christopher will testify that everyone involved in Frank's operation, that is, the surgeon, the surgical team, himself, and the other anesthetists present in the room, were all completely shocked by this story, and that nothing like that ever happened to them again. By the way, Christopher Errington will work in that hospital for another 3 years, and he says that, strangely, the whole team paid more attention to what they said in the operating room during future cardiac cases, thinking that maybe the patients could hear them. Alright, okay, this case is an interesting little appetizer. We're dealing with a patient who was clinically dead for over an hour and a half and yet came back. But can we really talk about resurrection? Not really. The duration of his death isn't long enough. And then, this case isn't well documented enough. It only relies on the testimony of the anesthetist Christopher Errington, who actually even changed the name of the patient, who wasn't named Frank. After all, we have to keep in mind that Mr. Errington probably has no reason to lie, but still, there you go. What I suggest for this investigation is to focus on a much stronger case, one that's much better documented, for which we have all the sources and all the documentation. The case of a man who supposedly drowned, died, and 27 hours after a very seriously confirmed death, came back to life. Right now this is much more interesting, much juicier. So here we go. Let's get a taste of this, and we'll see what it's worth. First, let me clarify for those who don't know that this investigation is part of a series of videos exploring 100 mysteries that are said to be inexplicable by science. Well, here we go for our 8th inexplicable mystery, the resurrections that are said to be confirmed. Just before we start, guys, I have a huge announcement to make, and I wanted to make sure you see it. I wanted to talk to you about the excellent project 1000 Reasons to Believe. Here's why. 1000 Reasons to Believe is perhaps one of the most ambitious French-speaking evangelization projects of our century, and I'm really happy to be part of the movement. This project aims to show that the Christian faith is true, unique, and unparalleled because there are thousands of reasons for Christians to believe. Here are 100 cases of miracles science can't explain, supporting Christianity. There are thousands, not just 100. And 1000 Reasons to Believe is trying to create the biggest list ever made. In my videos, we dive deep into some of these reasons to believe. But really, friends, honestly, if you want to go further, if you want to discover hundreds of other miracle cases, then head over to the 1000 Reasons to Believe website and subscribe to their newsletter. You haven't heard the last of 1000 Reasons to Believe on my channel because it's really the ultimate evangelization project that I really want to partner with Joan on. So let's get started to discover one reason to believe among the 1000 or more that exist. We are in France, 823 in France, Haute-Savoie. Ah, I see where you're going with this. Right away, something that dates back 4 centuries. Does that seem too old to you? But be careful. Just because it's old doesn't mean it can't be solidly confirmed. For example, we know many details about the fire of Rome, which actually took place almost 2000 years ago. We know that the fire started on July 18th, 64 AD in the Circus Maximus. We know that it lasted exactly 6 days and 7 nights, devastating the city. The details are precise. We know the accusations against Emperor Nero, who supposedly watched the fire from the Tower of Messine. And if we know all this, it's thanks to testimonies that were reported to us by Roman historians like Tacitus. Another example is the assassination of King Henry IV of France by Ravaillac, which also happened 4 centuries ago. We know that it happened on May 14, 1610 at 4 p.m., Rue de la Ferronnerie in Paris. Thanks to contemporary testimonies and official documents detailing the attack, we know exactly the circumstances and immediate consequences of this assassination. So sometimes we can be extremely precise, even if an event happened centuries or even millennia ago. So we can't just say, it's too old, so it must be false. In the same way, we can rigorously examine what happened in 1623 in Haute-Savoie and get reliable information if it exists. Well, let's go for it. I'm going to give you all the details and all the sources that allow us to know about this case, and you can form your own opinion. So, we are in 1623, 9 kilometers from Annecy, at the Cure des Oeillères. A cure is the house where the different priests of the church live. The priest, who is the head, and the vicars, who are like the assistant priests. In this Cure des Oeillères, there are some young boys who are boarders, so basically their classes are taught by the priests. And in this case, there are 2 young boys around 15 years old who interest us. Jérôme and his brother François Genin, you'll understand why these young boys study under the guidance of a vicar nicknamed Monsieur Crozet. This Monday, May 1st, Mr. Crozet, who has to leave very early, reviews the schoolwork from the past week at dawn. He's unhappy with what Jérôme has done and whips him before leaving the house. Jérôme, disgusted, wants to run away. He wants to go back to his family home in Sainte-Hélène-du-Lac, 80 kilometers further south. He manages to convince his brother François to leave with him. And that's when the worst is going to happen. They leave around 6:15 in the morning. After a few kilometers, they arrive at the Fier River, at this exact spot on the map. I remind you that we're not far from the Alps, and because of the melting snow, which was actually very abundant that year, it's the time when the river is at its highest point. At that time, there were no bridges, just simple planks that were regularly swept away by the current. Indeed, the Onyx Bridge, which you see a bit higher up, didn't exist yet. It was only built in 1937. François will later testify that at the sight of those 3 slippery planks, seeing the river looking particularly threatening, they really hesitate to cross. They even suggest to Jérôme to turn back. But Jérôme doesn't want to. He doesn't want to fall back into the hands of Monsieur Crozet. To reassure his brother, he announces that he will go first. Before they start, they say a prayer and promise that if they manage to cross without any trouble, they'll go to Mass at the Church of the Visitation in Annecy, where the body of Francis de Sales rests, who died just 4 months earlier. Francis de Sales, the former Bishop of Geneva, was well known throughout the region and was already considered a great saint during his lifetime. Jérôme moves forward on the planks, trembling. It's really very unstable. Suddenly, halfway across, gripped by fear, he slips, grabs onto the planks for a moment, and has time to shout, "Francis de Sales, save me!" Then he falls into the river. Immediately, his brother tries to help him, but he slips too. Clinging to the plank, panicked, he manages to reach the shore. Then he turns around, and he no longer sees his brother, just his hat floating in the current. He runs along the riverbank, downstream, trying to see his brother in the water, but there's nothing. It's like Jérôme suddenly vanished. swallowed up by the very deep river at that moment. François keeps searching, but he knows that every second counts, so the minutes feel like hours. According to the testimony he would later give to the investigators, he followed the river for about 200 steps during what felt like 10 minutes. Then he decides to go look for help. On his way back to the Oyers, he arrives after a 15-minute walk at the village of Honnex. There, he first meets a young woman, Anthony Raffin, a 20-year-old inn servant, then Martin Curlet, Louise de Ronzier, and several other villagers. Panicked, he asks them for help, explaining that his brother fell into the river and that he hasn't found him. Very quickly, a good part of the village is informed, and many will testify later during a serious investigation that will be carried out, but I'll come back to that. Approximately about 15 villagers head to the river in an effort to try to find Jérôme, while François goes back to the Oyer to inform the priests about their escape and Jérôme's disappearance in the river. After 3 hours of searching the river, from 9 in the morning until around noon, Jérôme's body still hasn't been found. On his side, François has just come back. He went to the Oyers for nothing since the priest and the vicar weren't there. He still asked to pass the message and to inform the priest or the vicar as soon as they returned. In the meantime, the number of people helping to search in the river has increased. Everyone is devastated and tries to comfort François. He starts to come to terms with the fact that his brother must be dead and probably still at the bottom of the shadows. He then looks for a volunteer to dive for the body, as they say in the area, meaning to dive in search of it. The people of Nex immediately think of Alexandre Raffin, who is the best diver around and has already searched for several bodies in the river, by the way. Alexandre Raffin is informed around noon as he's coming back from work. Of course, he's going to head to the scene right away with his cousin Marin, who had already been to the river in the morning, and with his son Martin. He will testify later. Since I'm used to diving for bodies that frequently get lost in the river, when I was informed, I took a rope and a weight that I use on these occasions to measure the depth of the water. And having measured it from the spot where I was told he fell, I found that it was about 31 to 32 feet deep. So it's extremely deep, nearly 10 meters, because of the exceptional snowfall that year. It's noon and night. There are now about 40 people at the edge of the river. Alexandre Raffin is getting ready to dive into the cold, deep water. Here he goes, he jumps into the water before he can get to it. Everyone is watching, worried, knowing that if Alexandre brings up the body, Jérôme's death will be official. After a quarter of an hour searching in the water, he comes back up saying it's so cold that he can't stay in any longer. To help him regain his strength, Jean Raffin sends his daughter Anthony to get some bread and wine from the village. After eating and resting, Alexandre agrees to make another attempt. He dives in the same spot and gradually moves down the river, going with the current, trying to look as much as possible at the bottom of the water to see if he feels or spots anything. This second attempt lasts much longer than the first, but ends the same way. Alexandre is too cold. He has to get out of the water. Well, yeah, wetsuits didn't exist yet. After another break, he makes the decision to continue the search from the shore. First to spot the place where the body carried by the current might have stopped against an obstacle like a tree or something else. Everyone there walks along the river for nearly an hour until they reach the spot where the stream flows into the river. Now, the hope of finding the body is fading a little. Some think he was carried far away and that he will never be found. But it's not over. On the way back, the group makes a stop a little longer at the spot where the river makes a sharp 90-degree turn, as you can see on the map. And several people think it's likely that this turn could have stopped the body. Moreover, Alexandre the diver knows that there's a hole at the bottom of the water here where there's always at least 3 meters of water, even during a drought. He thinks there might be a chance that the body is there. So the group once again plunges for the third time into this particularly murky water. He's searching but not finding anything. But when he suddenly makes the decision to come up, his foot hits something with the consistency of a corpse. It's definitely a body stuck in the water between a tree trunk carried by the river and several rocks. He's clearly dead, and getting him out of there is going to be really tough. So Alexandre prefers to come up and regain his strength. He rests again for about half an hour according to witnesses, then dives for the fourth time with his son Martin. Together, they manage to free the corpse. They bring him back to the shore where he is grabbed by the two closest men, Jean Raffin and Martin Collet. They will later testify that the body was horrible to look at and pitiful, with a face and eyes horribly swollen and full of water up to the neck. And indeed, he stayed in the water for about 8 hours, from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, the time of the last dive. Even his brother François can hardly recognize him, and he will testify later. He was cold as marble, and everyone believed he was so dead that if you were near the church, they said it was time to bury him. The group decides to bring the body back to Audenay. It's Alexandre Raffin, the diver, that he's carrying on his shoulders while his son holds his feet. Alexandre will testify, "I found him quite heavy for his age because of the amount of water he had swallowed." On the way, they happen to run into a passerby who is none other than Michel Bovard, a judge from Annecy. They take a break and Mr. Bovard clearly sees that Jérôme Genin is completely dead, as he will testify later. Anyway, the group keeps going and puts Jérôme's body in the barn of a local resident, Jean Raffin, located at 220 Route des Anses in Annecy. That barn no longer exists today, but the house built on its site still has a commemorative plaque for this event, as you can see on the screen. The priest from Villas, the neighboring town, Jacques de Bellegarde, has been notified, and he arrives around 5 p.m. at the small barn. He examines the corpse, confirms that he's dead, and would have buried him that very evening if the group hadn't explained that it was better to wait for Father Claude Poutot, who was in charge of these two young residents at the asylum. Father Poutot, who has been notified, has made the journey from the asylum and finally arrives at the barn, where he struggles to recognize the lifeless body of Jérôme. Very sad. He prays around the body of this young resident who had been entrusted to him. Full of confidence, he dares to ask God to bring this poor boy back to life through the intercession of Francis de Sales. This means that he asks Francis de Sales, like a friend, to pray to God for him for this intention. He promises that if he does, he will say 9 masses in his honor. Anyway, that night the mood is not festive. Everyone sympathizes with François, who has just lost his brother. A teenager so young has died so suddenly. Before leaving, Claude Poutot respectfully requests the owner of the barn, Jean Raffin, to carefully organize a wake. It was indeed the long-standing tradition at the time to keep vigil by the body to offer prayers for its departed soul, which was still believed to be alive in the other world. Anthony Raffin and 2 other women graciously volunteer for the wake, while Claude Poutot and François Genin head to Villas, where the priest generously offers them a meal. During dinner, François shares how the accident happened. When he explains that he and his brother had made a vow to attend Mass in honor of Francis de Sales before crossing the bridge, if they managed to get across, Father Poutot, who was still unaware of this detail, is very moved. In fact, he explains that he felt compelled to make a vow while praying in the barn in front of Jérôme's body, promising to have 9 masses said in honor of Francis de Sales if the young man came back to life. He actually brings it up again at the end of the meal to a parishioner who is getting ready to head to Annecy, and he asks him to take this vow to the tomb of Francis de Sales, who is buried over there. After the meal, François Genin would have liked to go back and keep vigil over his brother, but Father Poutot orders him to go to sleep because he's exhausted. The 2 priests return alone to the barn, place holy water there, and together recite the Office of the Dead, which is a prayer in front of the body. They come back quite late. After that, the villagers will take turns all night so that there is always someone to keep vigil over the body. After they leave, it will first be Anthony Raffin, Louise de Ronzier, and Jean Ramu who will take over. They themselves are relieved at the rooster's crow by the 2 cousins Martin and Marat Raffin, who stay until morning. Then Anthony Raffin and Louise de Ronzier come back again to take over. Meanwhile, around 6 in the morning, Father Poutot returns to the barn. He prays for over 2 hours and renews the vow he made the day before. The burial is then set for 11 in the morning, because since the night, the condition of the body has significantly deteriorated. You know, the process of decomposition of bodies after death is very quick. Today, funeral homes do everything to slow down this process, but if nothing is done, it happens quickly. So in the morning, the deceased's brother, François Genin, finds him, and I quote his testimony, even more hideous and deformed. In fact, a little earlier, at the rooster's crow, the 3 women who had stayed overnight had the same thought. The putrid smell coming from the corpse is getting stronger, to the point that the longer the morning goes on, the more the people keeping vigil have to step away from the body to make it bearable. A few minutes before the burial, the 2 priests come to bless the body, and Father Poutot instinctively recoils at the smell coming from it. They sprinkle the body with holy water, meaning they throw holy water all over the body. Then they go back outside while the body is placed in a shroud, a kind of large cloth that will then be buried directly in the ground, and because the priests start the beginning of the Mass by entering the church from the back. At that moment, about 40 locals are present in the church, waiting for the burial to begin. Anthony Raffin, Louise de Ronzier, and Jean Raffin approach the body to place the shroud. Suddenly they scream, fall backward, and are shocked. Anthony Raffin would later testify that when we tried to wrap him in the shroud, we were all scared to see him raise his arm. Letting out a big sigh, he exclaimed, "Oh, blessed François de Sales, This scared those who were present so much that some fell to the ground and others ran outside, making a lot of noise. Well, I think if that had happened to me, I would have definitely run away screaming. By the way, I'll share a little personal anecdote about this at the end. So, in the barn, it's total chaos. Those who are present shout loudly for the two priests. They didn't witness the scene, but all the other witnesses report exactly in the same order the three gestures of the deceased. First, the arm that raises. Secondly, the kind of sigh. Thirdly, the exclamation, "Oh, blessed François de Sales." The dead man sits up on the support he was on, a kind of bed or table. Everyone is obviously shocked, amazed, and can't believe it because about 27 hours after his death, Jérôme has come back to life. Well, the question we all clearly ask ourselves is this story true? What proves to us that this is actually verified and not just a legend that was made up afterward, or that the villagers were all in on it and invented this story from scratch? Well, to find out, let's look at the sequence of events that will help us understand everything and sort the true from the false. So after Jérôme's resurrection, as I was saying, the whole assembly was completely shocked, as you might expect. Some fell to the ground, some ran out of the church in a panic, and others even fainted, like Louise de Ronzier and Jacques Rameau. But very quickly, everyone starts to pray, some on their knees, others clapping their hands, and everyone is thanking God, shouting, "Miracle, miracle, he has risen." As he helped him sit up, Father Puto asked Jérôme if he recognized him, to which Jérôme nodded in agreement. Then Jérôme explains that he lost consciousness at the moment of the accident, and then he woke up in the barn. He will indeed testify later. "I don't remember anything that happened from the moment I was submerged in the water until the moment I came back to myself. I had no idea or memory of anything that happened during that whole time." He also states that when he opened his eyes, he immediately saw Bishop François de Sales in front of him, blessing him. He will repeatedly say without getting tired that this appearance of François de Sales was not just a figment of his imagination, but that he actually saw him with his own eyes as soon as he opened them, and that's what explains his exclamation. Well, the first question is whether this story is true. Why did Jérôme Genin see nothing between the time of his drowning and that of his resurrection? Because if there is life after death, he probably should have seen or felt something, like Franck, whom I told you about earlier, who saw himself outside his body and felt alive, like many people who have come close to death and seen their body from the outside before being resuscitated. I have a little personal theory about that, but I'll come back to it a bit later. Jérôme is then bombarded with questions, but he struggles to speak. To help him rinse his mouth, still filled with sand and mud, Anthony Raffin goes to get some wine. Jérôme then learns that he was underwater for 8 hours and dead for 27 hours. After having a good discussion with everyone, Father Puto is eager to get home to Les Oyeres to tell all the members of his church about this amazing miracle that just happened. So they declined the village priest's invitation to lunch. They give Jérôme some clean clothes, since his are still wet and muddy, and then Father Puto, along with François and Jérôme Genin, heads back to Les Oyeres. Upon arrival, Father Puto immediately goes to the church, rings the bell, and tells all the villagers who gather about the miracle. In the early afternoon, they then go to the rectory for a meal, where Jérôme shows a good appetite. François Genin and Father Puto are still in disbelief. And do you remember Michel Bovard, the judge from Annecy, who had encountered the deceased the day before? Well, believe it or not, that afternoon he visits Father Puto to offer his condolences. So, just imagine his face when he saw Jérôme in the flesh and blood. He must have really bugged out. By the way, it's worth mentioning that Jérôme Genin isn't fully healed. He still has sharp pains in his thighs, legs, and arms that were hit in the river and are still covered in wounds and scars. These pains will completely and suddenly disappear 2 days later, on May 4th, when Father Puto takes Jérôme and François to Annecy to the tomb of Francis de Sales to fulfill the vow they made to God. Years go by, but throughout the region, no one has forgotten what happened to Jérôme. On his side, he himself becomes a priest, the parish priest of La Rochette, until his death. In 1668, but it was in 1656, thorough investigation took place on the miracle of Jérôme's resurrection, which supposedly happened in 1623, 33 years earlier. Why does the investigation only take place 30 years later? In fact, you need to understand a bit of the context. François de Sales, the bishop who died in 1622, was well liked throughout the region, recognized everywhere for his holiness. In the years following his death, many Catholics asked God for graces through his intercession. For Catholics, you can indeed pray to those who have passed away and are believed to be with God, as if they were friends in heaven helping us, just like you can ask a friend on earth to pray for you. For those who want to know more, I had also conducted a whole investigation on the differences between Protestants and Catholics, which specifically includes this point about praying to deceased individuals. In short, for several decades, there were so many testimonies of unexplained healings and graces received through François de Sales, and even another case of resurrection, which I'll talk about in another investigation, that the Catholic Church decided to open a trial, a major general investigation, to find out what really happened. This trial can lead to what we call canonization, meaning that the Catholic Church recognizes that a deceased person was a saint, a true friend of God. So, for now, what we're interested in is the thorough investigation that took place to determine if Jérôme Genin was indeed dead for 27 hours and then came back to life. To get started, the investigators went to the region and interviewed a large number of different witnesses. They first started by questioning Jérôme Genin himself, in the flesh and blood. The fact that he exists and is alive right now in 1656 is beyond doubt. No, the question that interests the investigators is his alleged death after drowning in 1623. I don't know if you remember the first inexplicable mystery I talked about on my channel, which was about a man, Miguel, who had been amputated and whose leg supposedly reattached itself instantly. Well, it was the same. There was no doubt that Miguel had 2 legs at the time of the investigation. The only question was, had he really been amputated in the past? Well, it's the same here. Jérôme is alive in front of the investigators. So the only question that matters is, was he really dead in the past? But in reality, the investigators are very skeptical because a person could easily pretend to be dead and then wake up later. No, what the investigators are primarily interested in is whether Jérôme really spent 8 hours underwater. Because in this case, you don't need to know all the laws of physics to understand that it's perfectly impossible to survive after spending several hours underwater without a mask or oxygen, and of course, that didn't exist back then. I remind you that the world record for apnea, that is to say the longest time underwater without breathing by a human, is only approximately about 12 minutes, which is already quite good. I barely last 30 seconds. Anyway, the investigators are going to choose to interview 10 witnesses who played a key role in this case. Jérôme and François Génin, the father Clone Poutode, but also residents of Annecy like Anthony Raffin, Louise de Ronzier, Martin Curlet, or of course the diva Alexandre Raffin himself, and also Michel Bovard, the judge from Annecy. They will question them separately and in detail about all the events, asking them a lot of questions. All the documents from this trial are found in the 3rd large volume out of 6 of the investigations that took place regarding the miracles of François de Sales, which are still preserved today in the archives of the Monastery of the Visitation in Annecy. It's actually thanks to these documents revealed to the public, for example in this book, that I was able to make this video and tell you the whole story. This book indeed contains the exact testimonies of various witnesses as well as all the facts as reconstructed by the trial of 1656. And for those who are curious and want to get exclusive investigative reports, there's a really good newsletter called Edifiant.far that sends out 1 investigation a month on different topics related to the Catholic faith. Feel free to subscribe. It's a great compliment to my videos. Anyway, as I was saying, different witnesses will be questioned. Yet, they will all maintain a completely consistent version that leads to the facts as I've presented them to you. Before concluding too quickly that there really was a resurrection, several hypotheses are possible. First hypothesis, did all the witnesses lie? Or the second hypothesis, more likely, did they reconstruct false memories and exaggerate certain things that didn't happen that way at all, 30 years after the events? I'm not going to dwell too much on the organized lie hypothesis. If there had been a conspiracy, it raises several issues. Their motive is unclear. What was gained by convincing people of a local man's resurrection and inventing a coherent story? They gained nothing, neither glory nor money nor power. Jérôme, a priest, urged prayer to François de Sales. Witnesses were from Annecy. Anyway, when he talked about it, it was to invite people to pray to François de Sales as a friend in heaven. Secondly, the witnesses were chosen from among many other possible residents of Annecy. This means that all the inhabitants would have agreed among themselves to lie. But if it had been a lie, it seems impossible that everyone would have agreed to lie, and that no one would have cracked at some point and told the truth. I recall that there were about 40 inhabitants in the church at the time of Jérôme's resurrection, and that there were also about the same number of people who searched for Jérôme in the river throughout the day before. To imagine that 40 people came up with such a big lie that everyone would have agreed with for decades seems completely impossible. Neither of them would have agreed to participate in such a charade, or at least would have ended up denying it after a while. After more than 30 years of repeating the same version, the least we can say about these villagers is that they were sincere and truly believed in what they were saying, and not that all the residents were dishonest liars trying to make up a nonsensical story. Lies can sometimes be spread by people with common interests. But here, we have completely different residents, of all ages and from all social backgrounds, who only have one thing in common. They live in Annecy. And let's not forget that they didn't all know each other beforehand, since Jérôme, François, and Father Poutot were becoming blind spots, and there was even Michel Bovard, a judge from Annecy, who saw Jérôme's dead body while passing through the village of Annecy, purely by chance. So no, the idea of a widespread lie doesn't hold up at all. On the other hand, another hypothesis that's a bit more interesting is the idea that their memories weren't clear. One could say that after 30 years, they might not have remembered things very well and might have exaggerated certain aspects. And it's true that on some secondary details, the witnesses interviewed didn't all remember the same things exactly. For example, François Genin clearly remembers that on the evening of May 1st, Father Poutot told him not to keep watch over the body and ordered him to go to sleep, while Father Poutot doesn't mention this detail in his testimony. We have plenty of little examples like that on secondary details that can slightly differ depending on the testimonies. Another example, Anthony Raffin is the only one who noted in his testimony that the diver Alexandra Raffin ate to refuel after diving. The others didn't pay attention to it. These discrepancies are about secondary details and aren't crucial. The testimonies confirm the core story. They searched for the body from morning to mid-afternoon, with 4 dives by Alexandre Raffin. Jérôme spent 8 hours underwater, as a witness stated. People were on the riverbank, yet no one saw him until the diver retrieved him. Alexandre Raffin stated, "I have no doubt he remained drowned from the moment he fell until I pulled him out, as the river was extremely swollen, making it impossible for him not to drown." There were almost constantly several people on the riverbank, and no one saw him until the diver pulled him out. And as the diver Alexandre Raffin himself wisely stated at the time, "I have no doubt that he remained drowned in the water from the moment he fell until I pulled him out, because the river was so extremely swollen it was impossible for him not to drown, and therefore he couldn't have come out. And besides, it's certain that no one threw him into the so-called river afterwards." The investigators then wonder if the deceased was really as dead as everyone thought. Wasn't the resuscitation caused by a treatment or a medication? But this hypothesis makes the witnesses shrug. No one ever considered giving a remedy to that corpse. "All we thought about was burying him," says Marin Raffin. "His death was visible, palpable, smelly, and therefore obvious. There was no doubt about it." François Genin will testify, all the signs of death imaginable were there. He was incredibly swollen. His mouth, nose, and ears were full of sand. He was all bruised, black, horrible, pale, dreadful, and hideous to look at, and so changed that I had a hard time recognizing him. He had no movement or breath, as I saw after he was pulled from the water, and in the barn, both in the evening and in the morning, and from the hearing of those who kept watch over him and others who were present. He was cold as marble, and everyone believed he was so dead that if you were near the church, they said he should be buried right away. He had all the signs you could expect to know for certain that he was dead. In short, all the witnesses confirmed the horrible appearance of the corpse in the evening, and then during the night. And on that, all the accounts perfectly coincide. Everyone, finally, confirms the order in which Jérôme acted at the moment of his resurrection. His arm rising, his sigh, then his exclamation, "Oh blessed François de Sales." And you can understand that 30 years later, the witnesses still remembered this well, at least in broad strokes, since those 2 days must have been so significant and therefore unforgettable. I'm not going to go into all the details we have because there are really a lot of them. So if I do it, I know I'm going to become boring. Alright, one last interesting detail for the road. The water that Jérôme must have swallowed during his drowning was never spit out. When asked about this point, all the witnesses are certain. Jérôme Genin must have cleaned out his mouth, ears, and nostrils filled with sand and mud. But we didn't see him spit out a single drop of water, neither when he came out of the river, nor during the journey, nor during the night, nor after his resuscitation. The disappearance of the water that had swollen the body up to the throat also seems to confirm that we are indeed dealing with an inexplicable mystery. So it's up to you to form your own opinion on this case. But know that if what I've told you hasn't completely convinced you, once again, there are other arguments in this book. We have to accept reality, and today, the historical method doesn't allow us to deny all the evidence we have for this particular case. In any case, feel free if you want to dig deeper, to go read the archives kept in Annecy if you really want to check for yourself, and you'll see that the resurrection of Jérôme Génin is as solidly documented as the assassination of Henri IV by Ravaillac. And if resurrection exists, then it confirms that God exists, that there is life after death, and it brings to mind the resurrection of Jesus. By the way, just so you know, I did a complete investigation into the resurrection of Jesus from a historical perspective, and we actually see that we have a lot of reasons to believe that the resurrection of Jesus really happened historically. I'll let you discover all that after this video. Anyway, but come on, for this investigation, I didn't want to stop there, and I found us another case, much more recent, because I know we're all a bit the same. We like recent things, even though in reality, that doesn't mean it's more proven at all. So I found us another case that's almost like a resurrection, and it happened at the end of the 20th century. You'll see, it's quite surprising. So stay with me, because if the previous case didn't convince you, this one might just do the trick. But first, I just want to go back to a small point. Earlier, we asked why, if there is life after death, Jérôme, who was dead for 27 hours, saw nothing and remembers nothing. In fact, all the people who see something when they approach death, like those who testify to seeing their body from above, like Frank, are not actually dead by definition, since they came back, and we can't rightly call it resurrection. They just got really, really close to death. In fact, most of them report that there comes a moment when they see a sort of barrier, an insurmountable boundary, represented by a river or something else, and they know that if they cross it, it's a point of no return. There are things beyond that boundary that they're not allowed to see right away if they come back into their body and continue their life on Earth. Now, Jérôme Genin was actually dead, and yet for 27 hours. So it's more than likely that he saw things beyond that insurmountable boundary. So, we might think that maybe God didn't want him to remember, because these are things we're not supposed to know right now. Well, we'll talk about it later in another investigation dedicated entirely to near-death experiences. Alright, in the meantime, here's an incredible and more recent case that resembles a resurrection that I found for us. Ninth inexplicable mystery, the resurrection of Margit Heim in 1986. It's June 23rd, 1986 in Hermannshofen, a small village about 100 kilometers from Munich, Germany. That day, 3 teenage girls, 13-14 years old, Angela and Helga Berger, along with their friend Margit Heim, decide to go swimming in an artificial pool set up along the Geltnaar, the river that runs by the village. Around 3:30 p.m. Helga and Margit dive into the water. Usually they're pretty good swimmers, but this time, a tragedy happens. Angela, who was resting by the edge, doesn't see them come back up. Worried, the seconds pass, then the minutes. She can't see the bottom of the water and Angela is panicking. Suspecting that the worst is happening, she hops on her bike and rides as fast as she can to raise the alarm. At 3:50 p.m., 2 police officers arrive and immediately inform the river rescue station. He notices that a powerful whirlpool about 6 meters wide has formed. The explanation is simple. There's a drain at the bottom of the pool behind a grate where the water rushes in like a siphon, and the girls were sucked down to the bottom and pinned against the grate. The police officers try to dive in to rescue the girls, but they're unsuccessful. It's too dangerous. Things happen fast. The doctor and ambulance are there, while a helicopter flies over the accident site. At 4:13 p.m., an emergency rescue team arrives from Kaufbeuren, the nearest town. Diver Bärbel Müller put on her wetsuit during the trip. As soon as she arrives, she immediately jumps into the water and manages to bring Helga up around 4:20 p.m. I'm quoting the diver's testimony. She was unresponsive and severely hypothermic, her body completely blue with no slightest reaction. Rushed to the hospital in Kaufbeuren, Helga dies at 6:06 p.m., despite resuscitation attempts that started in the ambulance and continued at the hospital. Margit was brought up shortly after by another diver, Edgar Heinz Geilofer, after at least 40 minutes underwater, or maybe even closer to 50. Dr. Forster then confirms the teenager's death. Here's her testimony. She was clinically dead. Dilated pupils with no heartbeat at all. The flat electrocardiogram. She was intubated, and we immediately started artificial respiration and chest compressions. After that, we performed defibrillation at least once. On the monitor, a visible heartbeat appeared pretty quickly. We continued chest compressions until we could feel the first pulses in the throat. The pupils remained dilated. When the blood circulation restarted, I was afraid I had revived someone who would suffer from severe brain damage due to the accident. At that moment, I completely ruled out a full recovery. Margit is airlifted to the hospital in Kempten, where she arrives at 4:40 p.m. The doctors note a level 3 coma on the Glasgow scale, the most severe level. At this point, there's no reaction from the patient, and her body is being ventilated with a respirator. I'm not going to read you the medical report, which is a bit technical but also very grim, detailing Margit's dramatic condition. For those who want to know more, you can find a lot of details about this story in the book A History of Miracles by Joachim Boufflet. It's important the patient is severely hypothermic with a temperature of 29.4 degrees. As Dr. Forster explains, the brain can't survive without oxygen in the body for more than 30 minutes, especially without any breathing, and with a body temperature of 29 degrees Celsius. The heart started beating again during resuscitation, but the brain was deprived of oxygen for too long, so any potential survival would come with consequences. Dr. Forster then informs the girl's father, "There's no blood flow to the brain, and if the little girl survives, she will have irreversible brain damage. Moreover, since death is very likely, we can consider organ donation." In this desperate situation, Margit's loved ones have an idea. They want to pray to God through the intercession of Kreszentia Höss, a nun who lived nearby at the convent in Kaufbeuren in the 18th century. During World War II, it's said that she had already performed a miracle. In 1944, Kaufbeuren was indeed supposed to be bombed by the Allied forces. The townspeople then gathered in crowds at Kreszentia tomb, begging her, their friend in heaven, to ask God for the grace to protect the city. The sky was clear, and the planes were flying so low that you could see the bombs ready to be dropped. And yet, for reasons that seemed inexplicable, the bombers flew over the city several times without dropping the bombs. Aunt Margit's uncle then addresses the convent of Kaufbeuren and asks, on behalf of the teenager's parents, for prayers for her. The community immediately begins to pray, and the Mother Superior advises the Superior to make it a personal intention. Meanwhile, family and friends are making frequent visits to Krescentia's tomb. After 3 days, as Margit reacts surprisingly to stimuli, the doctors decide to transfer her to the neurological hospital in Munich. The improvement continues, as noted by the teenager's mother. On June 29th, Margit's eyes were half closed. When we returned to her in the afternoon, her eyes were completely open. On Tuesday, July 1st, when I went to see her, she was sleeping. The doctor told me that she would survive, but he didn't know her brain damage extent. On Wednesday, I brought her a booklet about Blessed Kreszentia that belonged to her. She reacts slightly when she sees him. I felt like she recognized him. From that moment on, the progress accelerated. Margit herself will explain later. I know that I was awake after a deep sleep and that what I was perceiving was very fragmented. I should have started everything from scratch as if I were a baby. Well, I started talking and walking again in no time. More, then a little while, then a little bit, a little while. Then, a few months later, Margit went back to school without any difficulty. In 1988, further tests showed that her recovery was exceptional, as she had an IQ of 115 according to one test. Later, as part of the canonization process for Kreszentia Höss, additional examinations will be conducted at the end of the 1990s, and witnesses will be questioned. The specialist confirmed the diagnosis. She is completely healed, in good health, and there's nothing to suggest any complications in the future. On January 11, 2000, the medical commission finally declares, so, with the miracle having been confirmed, Kreszentia Höss will be canonized on November 25, 2001. Quick, complete, and lasting, with no neurological after effects. Scientifically inexplicable. So, with the miracle having been confirmed, Kreszentia Höss will be canonized on November 25, 2001. In cases like this, some will say that the human body is amazing and that maybe science doesn't know everything yet. And it's true that we don't yet know all the laws of physics in detail. But what we know about biology is more than enough to say that a normal human being cannot spend 45 minutes underwater without having absolutely no after effects, while the absolute world record is barely 12 minutes by a highly trained human. And we can confidently say that a human being can't be in the most advanced state of coma possible, with a body temperature below 30 degrees, and then recover in just a few days without any difficulty, without any after effects. In short, it really seems that miracles allowing a transition from death to life do indeed exist. In fact, there are many more than we think. Even today, some have seen the dead come back to life and can testify to it. This is the case, for example, of Jean-Luc Traxel, a pastor who understood that all Christians are called to live out the word of the gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 9, verse 2. He sent them to proclaim the kingdom of God and heal the sick. I'm sharing an interview from the excellent YouTube channel NDML.
Have you ever truly and undeniably seen a miracle of the resurrection of the dead?
Well, I'd like to see them more often or more frequently, but I've had the chance to see them on several occasions, 2 or even 3 times in the past. The first time was in the beautiful and vibrant region of Africa, where I had the opportunity to preach the gospel in the Central African Republic. And then I always remember saying, but there you are in the crowd. If you have people who are seriously ill at home or even those who are dead, go get them and we will pray for them. I always remember suddenly and unexpectedly seeing people leave, running, and I don't know, approximately 20-30 minutes or so later, 4 young people arrived, yet another young person who had passed away. And there, Total simplicity. We did what Jesus showed us when he raised Lazarus. I commanded the dead to miraculously return to life once more, and I called upon the resurrection power in the name of Jesus to come into this dead body. And within a few minutes, life returned. That guy got up. It's a young man who indeed got up and was completely miraculously healed and had astonishingly come back to life. Truly, that's one of the healings. But the one that probably touched me the most is that of my own daughter. A few years ago, when she was just a child, she was very slowly starting to walk. And then one day, I found her quietly in the corner of the spacious living room, lifeless. Her body had already turned gray, green like this. There was no more life, and I cried out. I took her, I shouted, and my family arrived. My wife, who's a nurse, checked. Indeed, there was no more heartbeat, no more breath, no more respiration. And we think that we don't know how long she had been dead, but in any case, the doctors say it had been more than 30 minutes, even up to an hour. And when I took her, indeed, we were there with my 3 other kids. We cried out, "Oh God, perform a miracle." And above all, we were shouting, "Ameline, come back to life." And we were crying out in utter despair in our own home. And there, with the divine authority that God gave me, I commanded her spirit to return to her lifeless body and her soul to return and regain her life. And I released that miraculous power of life and resurrection. And then she miraculously started to breathe. Her heart began to beat. And it was truly a miracle. At the same time, the police arrived, the ambulances arrived. And when they saw that everything was working, they did all the tests, etc. And it turned out that indeed, subsequently, there was a significant major heart problem. But it was a real miracle that God gave us our daughter back.
There you go. You might think he's lying, but when you meet or read about Jean-Luc Traxel, you realize he's genuine and not trying to impress. He's not alone. Thousands testify to witnessing miracles. Thousands of people testify that they've seen miracles with their own eyes. And then, when you start following Jesus, you no longer need the testimony of others or videos like this, because you can see miracles, inexplicable healings in the name of Jesus for yourself. And that's what Jesus said in the Gospel of John chapter 1 verse 39, "Come and see." In other words, if you don't believe me, if you don't believe this video, well, no worries, come see for yourself. You'll see miracles right in front of you if you believe in Jesus. By the way, Jean-Luc Traxel, whom I just mentioned in the same interview, prayed live for the sick people watching the video. I'm going to show you the clip.
Can you, if you could, pray for the sick people who are watching you?
In simplicity, just place your hand if you have a headache, if you have cancer, a lump, a tumor, or if you need overall or emotional healing. It doesn't matter. Just place your hand on the part of your body that is sick. And as you do this, I ask you, Almighty God, to manifest yourself right now through a demonstration of power. This is through the wounds of Jesus who died on the cross 2,000 years ago. I'm tapping into this life-giving power that I'm releasing now into your life. In the name of Jesus, be healed.
And people have testified in the comments that they were indeed healed. Anyway, I can personally testify that I've seen miracles with my own eyes. And by the way, I told you I wanted to share a personal story about resurrections. Well, in this case, it's not a miracle, but I still wanted to mention it because it fits the theme. Last year, in 2023, my dad's health, who was 54, was getting worse day by day, and no one knew why. We eventually learned after many months that he had Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a rare illness affecting about 1 person in a million. And above all, it's a completely incurable disease. All the people affected die after the first symptoms appear, within a few months to a year. 15 months at most. When we learned the diagnosis at the end of April 2023, we already knew that my dad only had a few months left to live, until around the summer at most. It was a real shock because we don't know the causes of this disease. It just hits us like that, for no apparent reason, and there's nothing we can do about it. My faith had grown in the months before after researching many miracle cases. Nothing is impossible for God. We prayed to God through Léonie Martin, a 20th century nun and Thérèse of Lisieux's sister, for my dad's miraculous healing. The more serious, the more spectacular the miracle. As months passed, my dad's health worsened. But I believed. The more I hoped, the greater the miracle and glory to God. I even made a short video on my channel asking as many people as possible to pray for my dad. Here's a little excerpt. 2 days ago, I just discovered that my dad, Emmanuel, who is only 54 years old, has been diagnosed with Creutzfeldt-Jakob encephalitis. It's an incurable degenerative neurological disease that takes the patient in less than a year. I hesitated a lot before making this video because I didn't want to bother you with it. But honestly, I really think it's right for me to use this channel to share this new call for prayer. Anyway, he passed away on August 4th, 2023, but then told myself that I had to keep believing. Maybe he could rise again and the miracle would be even greater. By the way, in the gospel, there's a story that's somewhat similar. Jesus has a friend named Lazarus, and his friend is sick. Lazarus' sisters pray to Jesus to come and heal him, but he doesn't come right away. And Lazarus eventually dies. Some people then blame Jesus for not coming sooner. To which Jesus replies, "Lazarus is dead and I'm glad I wasn't there. Because of you, so that you believe. In fact, he's about to perform an even greater miracle than a healing, since he comes 4 days after Lazarus' death and raises him from the dead." I was thinking that for my dad, maybe God's will was also for him to die, to rise again, so that the miracle would be even greater. So my dad passed away, and I had a moment alone to pray at the funeral home. It was my first time praying for a resurrection, but I didn't feel silly. I knew that God can do anything. I knew of his many amazing miracles. So I really had faith and I prayed like that for a long time. For the record, I was afraid that my dad would sit up. I told myself that I would scream if that happened. So I understand the fear felt by people in Annecy in the church during the resurrection of Jérôme Genin. Anyway, after several minutes of praying, I thought to myself, I need to pray with more authority. So I commanded my dad's soul to come back into his body. And then suddenly, I heard his voice in my heart telling me, "Let me go." Then right after, you don't know what you're asking for. In the sense that I felt he was much better off where he was than down here. Right away I understood I couldn't not respect his freedom. Even God couldn't do it, didn't want to. My dad was free and he had lived his time. He was ready to go and he was much happier now where he was. In an instant, my mourning was over because I knew he was leaving freely, and I really felt that if he had wanted to come back, he could have. I had this feeling, I don't know how to explain it to you, that it was okay for God, but that it was my dad who didn't want it. So how could I not respect his choice? I could only accept his death since my dad himself accepted it with joy. That said, in other situations, we don't understand why God doesn't answer prayers. Well, friends, I actually don't have time to elaborate here. But for those who are interested, I created a training program, a complete guide to spiritual life in 7 modules on a separate platform. And in module 2, there's actually a course of almost 50 minutes on the meaning of suffering and the 7 reasons why God allows suffering, which are also answers to why God doesn't always answer prayers. I can only recommend that you take this training. I'll put a link in the description for those who are interested. With that, if you're eager for the next miracle cases, check out the website 1000raisonsdequar.com.